So, what is life really? Well, if you want to take an empirical approach, when you get down to it, no matter how complex or simple the life form is, whether you're talking about a blue whale, an elephant, a redwood tree, or a little bacterial cell, we're all made up of the same stuff. And that stuff is made up of things that are not living, specifically atoms, chemical elements. And these elements go in all sorts of different combinations to make bigger things and bigger things and bigger things. And eventually you end up with cells, tissues, organs, and the organism. So in order to really appreciate and study life, we need to learn a little bit of, I hate to say it, chemistry. We got to learn some chemistry of life, some basic chemistry, so that we can really understand the way that cells work together and how we can understand the way organisms work. So in this lecture, we're going to go over some basic fundamentals of chemistry. Not too heavy, I'll save that for a chemistry class, but we got to go over the basics. So, first of all, let's ask, what is matter? All life and all non-life is made up of the same stuff, and we call that matter. What's the matter? Well, matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. So, I'm matter, you're matter, this computer I'm recording this lecture on is matter, air consists of matter, baby toys, those are matter as well. The table that you're sitting on. All of this is matter. Anything that has mass and takes up space. And that matter is made up of fundamental components called atoms. So what are atoms? Well, atoms are chemical elements. What's an element? Well, an element is a pure substance. So for example, you might have heard of some elements like oxygen or hydrogen or carbon. These are all elements of something called a periodic table. A periodic table is the way we organize these things, and I'll show it to you in a second. So, in other words, one unit of an element is called an atom, and the atoms are the smallest units of matter that can't be broken down without changing their chemical properties. So, atoms are the building blocks of matter, and to date, there are 118 total elements of the periodic table. Now, 92 of these are naturally occurring. They occur in nature. And 26 of these are synthetic, meaning we humans have actually created them in a laboratory. Now, over here, you see a model picture of what it would look like if you take a bunch of these atoms and stick them together. At that point, you have what's called a compound, or if they're the same kind of element, model of a compound or a molecule. So you have two or more elements held together in fixed proportions. That means, for example, the compound for water is, you might know it, H2O. That means there's two atoms of hydrogen for every one atom of oxygen. And that never changes, because if you change that 2 and the 1 of the oxygen, you get a different compound. So they're held in fixed proportions. Water will always be 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. So here's a picture of an example of a periodic table, and it's just a way of humans organizing and making sense of all these 118 elements that we have so far. So the good thing is, in a biology class, you're not going to deal with that many elements of this periodic table. If you take a chemistry class, that's another story. Maybe they'll have you memorize it, but you don't have to memorize the periodic table in this class. But just kind of to get familiar with the way it's organized. You have columns, or groups as they're called, of different elements. You have rows, or what are called periods, of different elements. And I'll go over which elements are going to be important in this class in a little bit. But this is an example of a periodic table. You'll see that there's 118 elements listed on here to date, but we're always creating new ones, and who knows, we might even discover some more naturally occurring ones we haven't discovered yet. But to date, this is kind of what it looks like. So if you take an atom and try to figure out what's it composed of, you'll get to what are called subatomic particles. And there are 3 subatomic particles you need to know in this class. We have protons, neutrons, and electrons. And we can abbreviate protons with a little p, neutrons with an n, and electrons with a little e. So if you kind of wanted to figure out what an atom really looks like, can we see them just with a regular microscope? No, they're so tiny you can't even see them with a regular microscope. But you're going to see that in the center of each atom, the center we're going to call a nucleus, just like we call the nucleus of a cell. Same kind of idea, it means the center. you'll see that the protons and the neutrons are all together in this nucleus. So the plus signs here mean protons because protons carry positive charges. And the purple represented here are the neutrons. And then we have electrons that circulate around this nucleus. So it's kind of like thinking of toddlers around a cookie jar. Yet the cookies is what everybody wants to get hold of. And so these cookies are floating around in the center. And if you had 3 toddlers all after the same cookies, they'd kind of be all circulating around those cookies. But they never actually get to those cookies because they are repulsed by each other. They're trying to keep everybody else away while they get to the nucleus. So it's kind of like that. Electrons carry a negative charge. So the negative charge of the electrons is attracted to the positive charge of the protons. So these electrons are just constantly going around and around the nucleus because they're attracted to it, but they never get there because all the other electrons are keeping them away because they're repulsed by each other. So 2 negatives are repulsed by each other, a negative and a positive are attracted towards each other. So neutrons that are in the nucleus have no charge or a neutral charge. Protons have a positive charge, electrons have a negative charge. Now in their neutral state, the number of electrons is the same as the number of protons for an atom. But as we'll learn later, sometimes these atoms can change the number of electrons, in which case those numbers are not the same anymore. Now, if you want to figure out what number element you're dealing with, all you do is you count up the number of protons. So the number of protons in the nucleus of an atom is what gives the atom its property. That's what kind of element it is, what kind of atom it is defined by the number of protons. So I'll show you an example here. Let's say we're looking at the first element of the periodic table, hydrogen. Hydrogen is element number 1, therefore it has 1 proton in the nucleus and 1 electron orbiting that nucleus. Carbon is element number 6, so it has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons, and the electrons are orbiting the protons and neutrons in the nucleus. So let's take another example. I'm going to go back to this periodic table here. Let's find hydrogen. There it is. Notice hydrogen is element number 1, and therefore it's going to have 1 electron in its neutral state. Carbon is element number 6, and that means it has 6 protons in its nucleus. So what would happen if carbon suddenly gained a proton? It wouldn't be carbon anymore. Now it would be nitrogen, because nitrogen is element number 7. Okay, you might have seen real quick there that there were some other numbers on those on that periodic table. So you might have seen something that looks like this. So there's carbon. It has a 6 right there, and on the periodic table we just looked at, they stuck the 6 in the lower or in the upper left-hand corner. Same thing. So that tells us there's 6 protons. That's the same thing as its atomic number. So the atomic number is the number of protons in the nucleus of an atom. In the case of carbon, it's 6. In the case of hydrogen, it was 1. But oftentimes periodic tables have another number there. And for carbon, it says 12.01. And again, this number, depending on the periodic table you're looking at, might be up here, down here, whatever. But that is what's called the mass number. In other words, how heavy is basically the nucleus of that atom? Because you're taking into consideration the number of protons of that atom plus the number of neutrons. Those two things together make up the mass, or how heavy that atom is. Now, it's a decimal because there's also a slight mass from the electrons floating around, but the electrons are so tiny that they hardly have any mass at all. So a lot of times those just get ignored. So in other words, we're going to say the mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in the center of the atom. So let's take an example. Let's look at boron. Boron, and you can see it's illustrated with this big B here. So boron is element number 5. So that is its atomic number, meaning it has 5 protons in its nucleus. And you see this other number here, 10.8. That's its mass number. So if the mass number of boron is 10.8 and the number of protons is 5, how many neutrons does this element have? Well, that's what we're going to look at right here. So let's calculate the mass number. So let's go back to our example here with boron. I'm going to grab my trusty pen. Let's see. I'm going to grab the pen. I could change the colors if I wanted. Okay, I'm going to write the chemical element name, boron. And then I'm going to say that it has 5 protons and that its mass number, and in this case I'm not calculating the mass number, I am figuring out the number of neutrons. Okay, and we said our mass number is 10.8. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to write with this thing. Okay, so to figure out the number of neutrons, I'm going to say the number of neutrons equals what? Okay, so if mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons, and if I already know my mass number, it's 10.8, and I know my number of protons, it's 5, how would I figure out the number of neutrons? Just subtract, right? I'll take the mass number, 10.8, and I will subtract, so there's a minus sign, 5 protons, and obviously that gives me, that's a 0.8 down there, and 10 minus 5 is 5. So 5.8 is closer to 6 than it is to 5. So I can say that the approximate number of neutrons of boron is 6. Okay, so I have 6 neutrons in the center of boron. Make sense? Okay, or let's say that, let me go ahead and clear these things. I'm going to take my eraser here. Let's say that I knew the number of neutrons already. Let's say the number of neutrons was, 12. And I knew my atomic number, so I knew that my number of protons was 10. What is my mass number? So in this case, I would just say my mass number is going to be the number of neutrons plus the number of protons. Okay, so 12 is the neutrons plus 10. And you just add those together, and I get 22. Okay, so if I knew the number of neutrons, I knew the number of protons, I would just add them together to get the mass number. Okay, not too hard, right? Okay, so good thing is you don't have to know all 118 elements of the periodic table. You just need to concentrate on the ones that life is composed of. Now, we have several elements in us, but mainly we're made up of only 4 types of elements from out of those 118 on the periodic table. That's amazing. Whether you're a human or you're a tree or you're a whale or you are a star-nosed mole or you're a bacterial cell or a yeast, we're all made up of basically just 4 of those elements of the periodic table. That's very deep. Think about it for a minute. Now, what are those 4 elements? We basically have carbon. About 20% of our cells are made of carbon. Oxygen, about 62% of us is made out of oxygen. That's kind of weird too, and a lot of that's because of the water that we're mostly made of. 10% is hydrogen, and 3% is nitrogen. So, as complex as we are, we're basically just combinations of these 4 elements. Very few others are included in there. Just 5%, and those might be things we get perhaps from our diet, like iron, selenium, chromium, manganese, things like that. But basically 4 main elements. I mean, how cool is that? Those 4 elements in different combinations, adding in a few others, make us who we are. I just think that's fascinating. I don't know, maybe I'm just a dweeby. But anyway, now, later on we're going to learn about bonding, the way these elements come together to make compounds, to make cells, to make humans. Well, it's because of certain chemical properties of these elements that bonding is able to occur. If it wasn't for that, life on Earth could have never gotten started, and you wouldn't be sitting here learning about chemistry right now. So we'll talk about what we mean by having full outer shells or not full outer shells, and why that was important for life. So mainly, you have those 4 elements of life and a couple others here. So I've taken the periodic table here and scrunched it down to show the ones that are important for life. So I've basically taken out the center part of that periodic table and just scrunched the two sides together. So we already got introduced to hydrogen. Element number 1 has a mass of 1.008 for its mass number. So think about it. If the number of protons is 1 and the mass number is 1.008, which is basically 1, how many electrons does hydrogen have in its neutral state? 0. Weird, huh? Okay, so hydrogen, very important to life. Jumping over to the other side of the periodic table, we have carbon, which we already got introduced to, element number 6. Nitrogen is very important. So carbon, we're carbon-based life forms, and that means that most of the compounds in our cells have carbon as a basis to them. Nitrogen, very important. All of the proteins in our body, which are made up of amino acids, our genetic material, DNA and RNA, those have nitrogen at their base. Oxygen, another very important one to the compounds of life, so that's element 8. And then a couple others. Sulfur is important for some of the amino acids in our body. Phosphorus, another big component of our DNA, also important for our energy currency, ATP. So very few elements here that are important to life. And we'll be talking about some others like chlorine and fluorine, lithium and sodium and potassium. All those are very important to life as well. So if we wanted to figure out how elements interact together, then we have to know what's going on with their electrons. And so one way to diagram what an atom looks like is through what's called a Bohr shell model. And so I'm going to teach you here how to draw a Bohr shell model because it'll make learning how to bond elements together much easier for you. So what are some of the things that determine if two atoms are going to come together and form a bond? Well, the number and the arrangement of electrons is very important. And so these electrons, you can see from, let's just take carbon here, for example. Each one of these little blue dots represents an electron. And you can see that they're kind of just moving around the nucleus like we talked about, but they move in specific patterns. And we call these patterns orbital shells or valence shells. And where an electron is, which shell it's in, depends on its energy state, its potential to leave and form bonds. So for example, carbon, we already said it's element number 6, and in its neutral state it has 6 electrons. But these electrons are going to occupy different shells. So the very first shell, closest to the nucleus, we can call it the first shell, it only holds a maximum of 2 electrons. That's all it can hold. It can hold less, it can hold 1, but then it's not going to be happy because they're always trying to fulfill the maximum number of electrons their shell can hold. So carbon has 6 electrons, so that means it's going to fill its first shell before it sends electrons to the other shells. So it's going to put 2 electrons in the first shell because that's the max it can hold. And how many does that leave? Well, if it had 6 electrons and it's used up 2, that means it has 4 left. And so those 4 electrons are going to occupy the second shell, because the second shell can hold a maximum of 8 electrons. Okay, so 2 in the first, 4 in the second for carbon means that there's still 4 potential electrons that haven't been put into that shell. So it's used up all its electrons, but it hasn't filled all 8 spots of that outer shell. So it's not happy. It's looking to bond with other things to fill that outer shell. Okay, so let's just take note of that. The first orbital shell holds 2 electrons. After that, for our purposes for this course, it's 8 electrons. Now, those numbers get different when you get into like way out there with more and more and more shells. But for our purposes, we're only going to be looking at a few shells. So we can say 8 for the outer shell. And so as these electrons go to outer shells, they're basically, that means that their energy is increased. And so until they can fill that outer shell, they are ready to bond with other atoms. Okay, so carbon, 2 in the first, 4 in the second. So it actually is looking for 4 other electrons to fill that, to make that outer shell have 8 electrons. Nitrogen is element number 7. So 2 in the first, that means that there's 5 left over, right? Because it's had 7 electrons. And so it's going to put 5 into that outer shell, but it still wants 8 minus 5 is 3. So it's still looking for 3 other electrons, and it's going to look for those in other elements. And then you can see I've done this for oxygen and phosphorus and sulfur. But let's try some of these. So I'm going to go down to a periodic table here. Here's a different periodic table. And I'm going to grab another element here. Let's grab lithium, number 3. So lithium is element number 3. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to say, okay, lithium is number 3. So that means it has 3 protons, which means in its neutral state it has 3 electrons, right? And I'm going to abbreviate electrons like this. Okay, so if it has 3 protons, I'm going to write proton, proton, proton. So it illustrates 3 protons. Okay. Of course, it has neutrons. We can go look at the mass number again. Actually, this one, let me see if I can go back to finding. Okay, lithium has a mass number of about 7. So 7 minus 3 is 4. So it's going to have 4 neutrons. So I'll just put 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And there's abbreviations. I'm going to write a circle around here. So here's my nice nucleus here. I'm going to change pen colors here for a second so that we can look at the shells. Okay, so there's my nucleus. And now I'm going to say, okay, if it had 3 protons, that means it has 3 electrons. Well, let's draw our first shell here. If my cursor comes back. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to draw the first shell here. So we said the first orbital shell can hold a maximum of, that's not a very nice circle there, is it? Maximum of 2 electrons. So 1, 2 in the first. Come on, cursor. Okay, so I'm going to just write a little line here to represent 1 electron and another one here to represent 2 electrons. So 2 in the first, but we had 3 to start with, so how many left over? 1. So this 1 is going to have to go into the second orbital shell. And we said the second orbital shell can hold a max of 8. So the first shell holds a max of 2, second shell holds a max of 8. Well, we had 2 in the first shell, so there's just 1 left over. So I'm going to put that guy right here. Okay, so that second shell could hold a max of 8, but he only has 1 electron there. Is he a happy camper? No, right? 1 is the lowliest number. So he is not happy. So that lithium is going to be looking to fill that outer shell, or at least fill whatever shell is his outer shell. Now, it's a lot harder to try to look for atoms trying to give away 7 electrons to add to that 1 there to make 8. It's a lot easier just to get rid of that 1 and give it to somebody else so that you'll be stuck with 1 shell that has its 2 full electrons. It'll be happy. So this guy's going to be trying to get rid of that outer electron, so he'll be left with a full outer shell, and he'll be a happy camper. And this is going to lead to bonding, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so that's an example for lithium. Let's try another one. Go back to my thing here. I'm going to erase it, and let's go grab another one. Let's try fluorine. So fluorine is element number 9. So if we go back here, so fluorine is element number 9, which means he has 9 protons in the nucleus, and in its neutral state, 9 electrons. Okay, so I'm going to kind of abbreviate here. I'm just going to draw a little nucleus. We know that there's 9 protons in there, and then we could look at the mass number and figure out how many neutrons. And then I'm going to change colors here again. Let's do some green. Okay, so 9 electrons. So how many of those 9 will fit into the first shell? 2, right? Because it can hold, the first shell holds a max of 2. So I'm going to write 1 and 2. Okay, 2. So how many does that leave? Well, if he had 9. You've already accounted for 2. That leaves 7. And how many electrons fit in the second shell? Well, the second shell can hold a max of 8. We have 7 to stick in there, so let's stick them in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That octet rule to fulfill the 8 there. So it's a lot easier to grab it from somewhere else. So he's going to be looking for another atom to come in there and give him his 8th electron. Okay, so that would be for fluorine. Now, let me show you something else too, a shortcut. There's a couple shortcuts here that are kind of cool. Let me erase everything there. Now, there's other ways of representing elements here. So what I've shown you is called the Bohr shell diagram. There's other ones too, like let's call this, let's go back to fluorine. We're going to do what's called a Lewis dot diagram. Lewis dot diagram. So for a Lewis dot diagram, all you're going to do is look at the number of electrons in the outer shell. So we just saw that fluorine has 7 electrons in its outer shell. Well, we're going to take those electrons and put them in pairs. So let's start, and we're going to represent those pairs with dots. So let's take that, start going around and making electrons with dots. 1, 2, 3, 4, sorry, it's a big dot, 5, so now it's a pair, 6, here's another pair, 7. Okay, so we now have the 7 dots representing the 7 electrons in the outer shell. And notice that this one is a lonely guy, right? He's by himself. He doesn't have another electron to complete that pair. So this kind of tells you that he's not happy. They're going to be trying to look for another electron to complete that pair so that his outer shell is fulfilled. So that's another way of representing this stuff. Okay, here's another trick, another shortcut. Now remember I mentioned that the periodic table is arranged in groups, which are columns of elements, and rows called periods of elements. And each group shares some chemical properties with each other, and all the elements in a row share some chemical properties with each other. So for example, in this periodic table, it's labeled each group, each column, going all the way over from the left to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 18. Other periodic tables will use Roman numerals, like the previous periodic table I showed you. And others, when you get to this side, instead of saying 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, it just goes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, there's a reason for all of this. If you look at the numbers to the left here, these represent the period number, the row. And that tells you how many valence shells, how many orbital shells that element has. So for example, if I look at, what did I just do there? If I look over here at, for example, sodium, Na, we talk about sodium a lot in this class. Sodium is element number 11, but it's in row 3. So that means that right off the bat, I know sodium is going to have 3 orbital shells. Without me even having to draw it all out, it's going to have 3 orbital shells. And if I look at what group number it's in, aka what column it's in, that's going to tell me how many electrons are going to be in that outer shell. Now, like if you get over here to fluorine, fluorine is in group number 17. So I'm just going to look at the ones place here of that number, and that will tell me that there are going to be 7 electrons in the outer shell of fluorine, and fluorine is in period 2, so it's going to have 2 shells. Well, that's what we just did, right? It had 2 shells and there were 7 electrons in the outer shell. Going back to sodium, it's in row 3, so it has 3 shells, but it's in group 1, which means it's going to have 1 electron in its outer shell. So let's try that and see if that's true. So let's take sodium. It's element number 11, so it has 11 protons, so it's atomic number 11 protons, and its neutral state it also has 11 electrons. So if we did the Bohr diagram of it, in its first shell, it's going to have 2. So 11 minus 2 is 9. That means we've got to draw another shell. That second shell can hold a max of 8. So 11 minus 2 is 9. So that's more than 8. So let's draw the 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 2 plus 8 is 10. We're still missing an electron. So we got to draw one more shell. So now we're at shell 3, consistent with the fact that it's in period 3 on the periodic table. And there's only 1 electron left. So there's your lonely electron. And of course, sodium was in group 1, telling us that there's 1 electron in the outer shell. And booyah, there it is. So sodium obviously is going to be very chemically reactive. It's looking to get rid of that lonely electron, and therefore it's going to readily form bonds with other elements. Okay, I hope that made sense. Something else, isotopes. Isotopes are atoms with the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. Interesting. So isotopes are things that can easily form radioactive elements. So you've probably heard of radioactive elements, and we'll go over some of the properties and applications of isotopes in a minute. Here's an example. So carbon, the kind of carbon that occurs in mostly in our cells is what you call carbon-12. And so it has 6 protons, right, because its atomic number is 6. And in its neutral state, it has 6 neutrons and 6 electrons. All well and dandy, right? You just learned this. But over time, elements tend to undergo what's called radioactive decay. They actually start gaining neutrons in their nucleus. So over time, these 6 neutrons might pick up another neutron to have 7 neutrons. And that, instead of being called carbon-12, it becomes a radioactive isotope of carbon called carbon-13. And further along, it might pick up yet another neutron. So now it has 8 neutrons and becomes carbon-14 because the mass number will be 6 plus 8, 14. It's radioactive. And have you ever heard of carbon dating, where they figure out how old a fossil is, for example, based on its ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 to carbon-14? Because each element has its own time period for radioactive decay. And so if they know how long it takes an isotope of carbon-12 to turn into carbon-13, and how long it takes that to turn into carbon-14, they can actually measure the different concentrations of these different isotopes in, for example, a fossil bone, and figure out how old that bone is. They also do this with uranium dating, for example. Sometimes these radioactive isotopes might not be so good in the case of, like, the atomic bomb, right? Or in the case of nuclear power plant meltdowns, like happened in Chernobyl, or might be happening in Japan right now with Fukushima. So anyway, the idea is isotopes are just different versions of the same element. They've just picked up a different number of neutrons. Well, what would happen if they started picking up a different number of protons? Well, that wouldn't be an isotope. That would be a different element, right? Because the number of protons defines the element. So isotopes are the same number of protons, just different number of neutrons. So here's some practical uses of isotopes. They're really good for using as tracers. For example, how did they discover that plants breathe using the process of photosynthesis? Well, they basically fed plants a tracer, an isotope of carbon, carbon-14, instead of carbon-12, and using a special machine called a mass spectrometer, they can actually go in and trace where that radioactive isotope goes. And in this case, they could trace the carbon-14 through all the parts of the cells of the plant and figure out that it was actually the same carbon that the plant was breathing in, the carbon dioxide. Of course, they labeled it because it's carbon-14 instead of carbon-12. The plant was breathing in that carbon, and it was being repackaged and remanufactured in the plant's body and gets spit out in the form of glucose, a sugar that contains 6 atoms of carbon, but in this case it was laced carbon, right? It was carbon-14 instead of carbon-12. So they actually were able to trace exactly what happens to the carbon from the atmosphere going into the plant and what comes out of it. It gets rearranged and put into a sugar that ultimately forms the base of the food chain for us. They've done similar thing in terms of plants taking up nutrients, phosphorus nutrients. They used an isotope of phosphorus. Screening for thyroid disease in humans. They can actually give you an isotope of iodine, iodine-123, and trace it through your thyroid and figure out whether it's the iodine is being processed correctly in your thyroid. Another relevance to what's going on in Fukushima. Same thing for if you get a PT scan, they can look for abnormalities in your metabolic uptake by feeding you radio-labeled glucose, like a glucose solution, a sugar solution. Here is an example of trying to figure out what happens to elements that are taken up by insects. So this is a dung beetle right here. And so you can actually feed the dung beetle an isotope of carbon, carbon-13, mix it in with the dung, the cow dung, because that's what dung beetles like to eat. And those dung beetles will take up that carbon-13 into their mouth, reprocess it in their bodies, and they actually produce a defensive secretion. So you can whack the end of the beetle and hold up some filter paper, and it'll spray a disgusting smelling spray onto that filter paper, and it uses that as its defensive secretion against predators. And if you take that filter paper, run it through a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, a very fancy piece of chemical equipment, it'll actually show you the ratio of different elements in that defensive secretion, and you'll see a spike on the graph come up where carbon-13 was. So in other words, you are what you eat, right? You just reprocess this in a different way. Okay, so we were talking about that sodium and what happens with its lone electron. So here's its electron in its outer shell. It's not happy. It wants to get rid of that thing. It wants to be stable. It wants to fill all the spots in its outer electron shell. So this guy's missing 7 other electrons in that outer shell, so it's easier to just get rid of that lonely guy so that you'll be happy with what you have in your second shell instead of your third shell. Well, if he does that and he gets rid of that outer electron to make a nice happy camper sodium here, that sodium is now called a sodium ion because it's changed charge. So electrons carry a charge of -1. And so when you've lost that negative charge, it actually becomes a more positive element. Think of it this way. If you get rid of all the negativity around you, you become a more positive person, right? Well, same thing here. If he gets rid of that negativity, that lone electron right there, he becomes a more positive element. And we call him a positively charged sodium ion. And we're going to write him like this, Na, and because he's lost 1 electron, he gained 1 positive charge. Because he's lost 1 ounce of negativity, he's gained 1 ounce of positivity. You can think of it like that. So you write the charge of the ion kind of as a superscript up here. So this is a sodium ion. Okay, it's positively charged. Let's take some examples of other ions. If you have chlorine, let's just take a shortcut. Let's take a peek back at the periodic table here. Here's sodium. Or sorry, we're going to do chlorine. So here's chlorine. It's in group 7, right? VII means 7, or you could look at the 7 of the 17. So that means he has 7 electrons in his outer shell. He's in period 3, so he has 3 shells. So he has 7 electrons in his outer shell. So let's go back to where we were here. And if you did the orbital diagram, there's your 7 electrons out of there. Well, it's a lot easier for him to gain an electron from someone else than to try to lose those 7 electrons so that he can complete his outer shell of 8. And so he's going to be looking to gain an electron. And so if we, let me go back down to my eraser down here, get rid of what I just wrote, and go back to my pen. He doesn't want to get rid of that. That's okay. Okay, so I'm going to put chlorine here. Chlorine has 7 electrons in his outer shell, but he wants to gain 1 more, which is great because let's say sodium comes along. Sodium wants to get rid of 1. Chlorine wants to gain 1. So he's going to gain an ounce. So he's going to gain an ounce of electronegativity. He's going to gain that electron. So because he's gaining more negativeness, he's going to become negative. So he's going to become a negatively charged ion. Chlorine with a minus sign. Okay, so you see how that works? And once sodium gives chlorine that electron, they now form a bond. And they create the compound sodium chloride. NaCl, NaCl, better known as table salt. How does all this happen? Let's see if you watch this for a while. So this is what I just described. Here's your sodium ion, and here's your chlorine ion. And they come together, and now you have sodium chloride. So again, this diagram up here shows you how sodium transferred that electron to chlorine, and now you got a positively charged sodium ion, a negatively charged chlorine ion, and they form table salt together, sodium chloride. And when you take a bunch of those sodium chloride compounds and put them all together, you actually get a crystal, and we call this table salt crystals, which you'll be looking at under a microscope, by the way, if you're taking the lab. Okay, so now it's not always true that atoms form ionic bonds. Sometimes instead of transferring electrons, they share electrons. So this is kind of dark, you may not be able to read it, but it says when atoms bond by sharing of electrons. So ionic bonds were transferring of electrons, covalent bonds are sharing of electrons. And I like to call these Barney the Purple Dinosaur form of bonding because Remember, Barney taught us that sharing is caring. So instead of me taking your cookie, let's share our cookie and we'll be friends and we'll form that bond of friendship. And that's what happens with covalent bonding. So let's take a quick example with hydrogen. So you remember hydrogen was element number 1, which means in its neutral state it has 1 electron. So here's its poor lonely electron here. And if you were to draw a shell here, remember the first shell can hold 2 electrons. So hydrogen's looking for 1 more electron. Well, here comes along another hydrogen element, and he also only has 1 electron. Well, if he gave the other guy his electron, he wouldn't have any, and that wouldn't be good either. But if they share, they'll both be happy. Because let's see what happens here. So if this guy and this guy form a bond, a covalent bond, now from each perspective, they both have the 2 that they need. So just look at that first hydrogen and say, okay, this hydrogen has 1, 2. He's a happy camper. And this hydrogen has 1, 2. He's a happy camper. So by sharing their respective electrons, they've made both happy and they've formed a covalent bond. Now, because hydrogen and hydrogen are the same element, they share the pool of those electrons equally. And so we call that a non-polar covalent bond because there's an equal distribution of the electrons. Same thing with chlorine. Let's say you had chlorine here and chlorine here come together. This chlorine only has 7 outer electrons, so he's looking for 1 more. This chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer shell, so he's looking for 1 more. So if they share their lonely electrons together, now they're both happy. Okay, just look at this chlorine's perspective here. He has now, thanks to the covalent sharing bond, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He has his 8 outer electrons. He is a happy camper. And same with this one. Now look at the perspective just of this electron, or this chlorine atom here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He's a happy camper. Again, they're both the same element. They're both chlorines, so they're equally distributing those electrons. And so, again, that's a non-polar covalent bond. Now, sometimes you'll get covalent bonding between elements that are not the same. Water being the perfect example. Water is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. So this one's a little more complicated. Okay, let's just look at the oxygen. Oxygen's number 8. So that means he has 2 electrons in his first shell. And 8 minus 2 is 6. So 6 electrons in his outer shell. Well, here's a hydrogen. We already said he had 1. So imagine one of those is his. Here's another hydrogen. One of those is his. Well, oxygen's looking for 2 more to make 8 because he has 6 in the outer shell. Each hydrogen's looking for 1 more. So what if oxygen shared 1 of his electrons with hydrogen and hydrogen shared his electron with oxygen? And same thing over here. Another electron from oxygen was shared with hydrogen and hydrogen shared his electron with oxygen. Well, now each has fulfilled his outer shell's potential. So let's count them up. Just from the perspective of oxygen, thanks to the sharing is caring, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He's happy. From this hydrogen's perspective, he has 1, 2. He's happy now. And from this hydrogen's perspective, 1, 2. He's happy. So everybody's happy. Now there's only one caveat here. Oxygen is a much bigger element than hydrogen is. And he has now a total of 8 in his outer shell, whereas each hydrogen only has 2, thanks to the bonding. And so there's a lot more negativity on the oxygen than there is the hydrogen. And so that oxygen, that big old oxygen, is going to kind of pull the charges towards himself. He's going to be kind of the selfish sharer. And so you're going to end up with oxygen having a partial negative charge and each hydrogen having a partial positive charge because some of their negativity was pulled towards oxygen. So oxygen gained some negativity and hydrogen lost some negativity. So because of that difference in charge, the difference of the spreading of the electrons over this compound formed what's called a polar covalent bond. Okay, here's some other examples. Here's methane. Methane is one of the principal greenhouse gases contributing to climate change. It's produced from the burning of fossil fuels like driving a car, produced from cows, You get the idea. Methane is compound CH4. So if we have carbon here, element number 6, 2 electrons in the first shell, 4 in the outer shell, and 4 happy hydrogens or unhappy hydrogens come along. So this is the line diagram, CH4, because 4 hydrogens for every 1 carbon. Again, they're going to form a covalent bond so that everybody's happy, because carbon in its neutral state only has 4 outer electrons. He wants 4 more to make 8. So if there's 4 hydrogens along, each one wants 1 more. They share all their electrons. They're happy. Ammonia is a little bit of a different thing here. Now carbon, because there's 4 hydrogens, there's an equal pool of the electrons on all sides. So this actually forms a non-polar covalent bond. Ammonia, though, NH3, is going to be a polar covalent compound because the charges are not going to be equally split. Because you see N has 3 hydrogens around it. And let's look at exactly how this compound forms. So I'm going to take out my trusty blank page here. So nitrogen is element number 7, and he's group 5. We can double check that. So nitrogen is group 5. So he's going to have 5 electrons in his outer shell. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we're pairing that up. And here comes hydrogen. Each one has 1 electron in his outer shell. This one has 1 electron in his outer shell. And this one has 1 electron in his outer shell. So now if we start matching up and start sharing bonds, we can form a bond here. So we'll pair that guy up. We'll pair that guy up. And this is going to be kind of weird. We can pair this guy up right here. Okay, so they formed a bond. But notice that this pair right here doesn't have a home. He's still stuck on the nitrogen. And so that gives nitrogen an extra negative charge that it doesn't want. So if we come back to here, you can kind of see that there's no hydrogen on this side. So these little electrons have nowhere to go. And so this makes this a highly polar molecule or compound, because now you have this extra negativity on the nitrogen. So the electric charges are not shared equally over the compound. Let's take another example of how to make a covalent bond. Let's take magnesium. Magnesium, if you check the periodic table, is element number 12, and he's in group 2. So he has 2 electrons in the outer shell. So I'm going to take 1, 2. And let's say we had 2 chlorine atoms come along. Chlorine is element number 17, and it's in group 7, so he has 7 electrons in the outer shell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there is 1 lonely electron here. And same thing for this guy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So again, 1 lonely electron here. So this guy, magnesium, has 2 lonely electrons. So this lonely electron will bind with the lonely electron on that chlorine. And this lonely electron here will bond with that lonely electron in the chlorine there. And so this guy has actually formed a covalent bond, but notice it's what we call a double covalent bond. There's 2 bonds that were formed to account for all those electrons. So if you were to do this as a line diagram, we'd have magnesium. You'd write 2 lines here, each representing a pair of electrons, and 2 atoms of chlorine. Okay, so we'd have 1 on that side, and we'd have 1 on this side as well. Now, because these are both chlorines, and they're pooling equally on either side of the magnesium, those electric charges are distributed equally over the compound. So this is a non-polar covalent compound. And if you want to draw this as just the normal name of the compound, we'd write magnesium chloride, and I'd have a little 2 subscript down here because there's 2 atoms of chlorine for every 1 atom of magnesium. Hope that makes sense. I will post some videos that will kind of explain these to you. I don't think the sound will work on this thing, but let's try it. Yeah, the sound's not going to work on this, but I can kind of narrate what's going on. So this is ionic versus covalent bonding, and I can actually click on any one of these and we can get a demonstration. So first let's look at an ionic bond. So this is sodium fluoride here. So if you take sodium, there's 1 electron in the outer shell. Fluorine is group 7, so it has 7 in the outer shell. And in this case, sodium is going to transfer his electron to fluorine. Now they're both happy campers. They made an ionic bond, and that is going to create a positively charged sodium ion, a negatively charged fluorine ion. Positive and negative attract, so they formed an ionic bond, and you get the compound sodium fluoride in this case. And if you get lots of those together, then you'll get a little crystal of sodium fluoride. Okay, so that's an example of an ionic bond. If we look at F2 here, we have 2 atoms of fluorine. Each have 7 electrons in their outer shell. They're going to form a covalent bond where they share, each of them shares their lonely electron, and so now there's 8 electrons from each one's perspective. They're the same element, so they shared the charge equally, and that's what this little cloud here is showing, that the charge is equally spread, so they formed a nonpolar covalent bond to create the molecule F2. So that was an example of covalent bonding right there. Okay, now if we, and again this is going to show you how that charge is equally distributed over these molecules, over those atoms. And now finally, if we go to HF, hydrogen fluoride, this is going to show you that, okay, hydrogen has 1 lonely electron it wants to get rid of. Fluorine has missing 1, so they're actually going to share. So now hydrogen has 2 and fluorine has its 8. But because fluorine is a much more electronegative atom, that negative charge is going to be kind of shifted towards fluorine. And so if we look at a cloud that kind of explains these things, we could draw it that there's going to be a much bigger cloud of electrons around fluorine than there is hydrogen. So the electric charge, as you can see here, is kind of shifted towards fluorine, so they're not sharing their charges equally. Therefore, this is a polar covalent bond. They're still sharing their electrons, they're still caring, but fluorine's a little bit greedy. He's taking more of that negative charge than hydrogen is. So I hope that little, and this little sign here means partial. So fluorine ends up with a partial negative charge, just like the oxygen did in water, and hydrogen ends up with a partial positive charge. So that is a polar covalent bond. So I hope that this little animation kind of helped clear stuff up for you. Okay, so let's move on here. Let's see if this will let me out of it. Let's go back. Okay, so I'm going to go back to here. All right, so you've learned about ionic bonding, you've learned about covalent bonding, both polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. Another kind of bonding that I want to talk about is called hydrogen bonding. This just means bonds between hydrogen atoms. But that kind of bonding is so important for life. It makes up the way we keep the backbones of our DNA molecules together. These two sides of this double helix are attached via hydrogen bonds. Many, many, many compounds in our body have these hydrogen bonds. Now, these bonds are weak, but never meek. In other words, they're very important, so they're not meek, but they are weak bonds. They're easily broken and easily formed. Very important. If we weren't able to take those weak bonds and unzip them, we couldn't replicate our DNA. Life on Earth would have never gotten started. And all the other compounds of life, water. We couldn't break up water molecules in our metabolism, and therefore you wouldn't have all the reactions that occur in our body. So hydrogen bonds are easily broken, easily formed, important to life, and that fact that these bonds are easily formed and easily broken is going to help them to bind with other atoms and molecules to create all the compounds of life and all the chemical reactions of life. So water is the basis of life. We're mostly water, which is crazy. Now you can see a water molecule kind of looks like Mickey Mouse, right? He has 2 ears and a face. But water has some very, very interesting properties. It's an excellent solvent. That means things dissolve in it very easily. Very, very important because, you know, when we consume our food, we want to be able to break up water and stuff in it. It also means that water is easily pollutable. We can put pollutants into the water, and because water is a solvent, it'll easily dissolve these pollutants into other forms. But it's cohesive and adhesive. It means that it's sticky. Like imagine a redwood tree. How do you get water from the roots of the redwood tree all the way up to the leaves 300 feet in the air? Well, water molecules like to form hydrogen bonds with each other. So, for example, the hydrogen on one water compound might hydrogen bond with the face part, the oxygen, of another one. And so they're kind of sticking together, kind of like if you suck water up through a straw. How do those water molecules go up that straw? Well, they're adhesive, they stick to each other, and they're cohesive. They like to stick to the sides of the container. And so because of that, they're under high tension, so you can get a little insect like this water strider actually walking on the water, forming, because of the tension between the water molecules here, his foot just kind of glides along the top of it. It has polarity, meaning it has partial negative and positive charges, so it's always looking to bind with other things. And it has properties in terms of being how it reacts to chemicals that are hydrophilic versus hydrophobic. So hydrophilic means love, hydro means water. So it'll dissolve in compounds that are hydrophilic, or i.e. they are polar, meaning that part of them carries a charge, kind of like other water molecules or like the hydrogen fluoride we were just talking about. Hydrophobic means water-fearing. So water does not like to mix with hydrophobic compounds like oil. So remember your salad dressing. The vinegar is polar, it's hydrophilic. The oil is non-polar, it's hydrophobic, and so if you shake it up, the vinegar will separate from the oil. So a solvent is the thing that does the solving, or the dissolving. Solute is the thing being dissolved. So water, very, very important compound for life. If it wasn't for water and hydrogen bonding and its chemical properties being polar, life on Earth wouldn't have ever gotten started, and you wouldn't be here listening to this lecture. Whew. Okay, just a couple other things. You're going to encounter in this class chemical equations. So where we're going to take some different compounds, react them together. Those are called the reactants, and they're going to rearrange to form the products. So for example, you see here the chemical reaction for photosynthesis. A plant breathes in 6 compounds of carbon dioxide, CO2, and of course you have to water your plants. They need water. So let's take 12 compounds of water. So that this 12 means there's 12 molecules of water, 12 Mickey Mouse faces. 6 CO2s would mean 6 sets of the compound carbon dioxide. And what the plant's going to do through its photosynthetic mechanisms, it's going to rearrange these things. And so now you're going to spit out 6 molecules of oxygen. So plants breathe out oxygen. 1 compound of C6H12O6, that is the compound glucose. It's a sugar that forms the basis of our food, and 6 compounds of water. So plants are going to produce water in the process of photosynthesis. Now, what's important to realize here is that your reactants and your products are always balanced. In other words, we can't do the I dream of Jeannie thing and suddenly make atoms appear out of nowhere. We can rearrange them, but we can't create something out of thin air. So we're always going to have the same number of each kind of element on both sides of the equation. So let's take an example of this. So we have 12 waters. Well, how many hydrogens total do we have here? Well, there's 2 hydrogens in every compound of water, and we have 12 compounds. So 12 times 2 would mean 24. So I'm going to write 24 hydrogens here. And how many oxygens do we have? Well, here's 1. We can pretend there's a 1 there. So there's 1 atom of oxygen for every Mickey Mouse. But there's 12 water molecules. So 12 times 1 is 12. So we have 12 oxygens. But that's only from the water. We have oxygens over here as well. So here's 2 oxygens for every molecule of carbon dioxide. And we have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So 6 times 2 is 12. So we have another 12 oxygens over here. So we have a total, 12 plus 12, this 12 plus that 12, we have 24 oxygens on the left side of this equation, on the reactant side. And 6 times 1 for carbons. So we have 6 carbons. So 6 right there. 6 carbons. So let's check this side. 6 times 2 is 12 oxygens there. Okay, and here we have another 6 oxygens from the glucose molecule right there. And 6 times 1 is 6 oxygens from the water over there. So 12 plus 6 plus 6, we end up with 24 oxygens. Cool. We had 12 plus 12, 24 oxygens on the left side. So our oxygen is balanced, right? 24 oxygens on the reactant side, 24 oxygens on the product side. How many carbons? Well, we only have these 6 carbons right here. That's balanced, right? We have 6 carbons over here, 6 carbons over there. We're good. And finally, hydrogens, we have 12 right there, and 6 times 2 is 12 right there. So we have a total of 24 hydrogens on the product side. Okay, so everything's balanced. We didn't do I Dream of Jeannie on here, right? We had exactly the same number of atoms on the left side as we did the right side. So we have what's called a balanced equation, because matter can neither be created nor destroyed, just rearranged. And this is what our body does. This is the metabolism of organisms, is to take compounds and rearrange them, use them for what they need, get energy out of it, and spit out something else, just with the same atoms, just rearranged. So this is pretty profound. It's kind of like the circle of life, right? Have you ever seen The Lion King, where he talks about the circle of life and how we die and we become something for the grass and this kind of stuff? Because you can never invent atoms out of thin air. Everything gets rearranged and formed into different compounds. So when you eat a burger, you could be eating atoms in your burger that were part of the body of Alexander the Great hundreds of years earlier. Amazing, isn't it? Everything just gets cycled and cycled. We've never invent new elements. First part of chemistry, I know it's pretty heavy stuff, so please ask me questions as we go along. I'll try to give you as many links and websites as possible to help you out. Definitely read your book, and stay tuned for the next part of this lecture, where we talk about the chemistry of life, specifically the compounds of life that include our carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Till then, I will see you soon.